Mirkwood. Dark, impenetrable, life-threatening. A thicket of twisted plants inhabited by insidious creatures. What was this forest? Why was it so evil and dangerous? Was it always like this? And what happened to what is probably the largest forest in the north of Middle-earth after the events of the War of the Ring? Mirkwood, a name that sends shivers down the spines of most peoples in Middle-earth. A vast forest, dark and deep, even at the end of the Third Age. For there, people were reminded that once the lands of Middle-earth were not covered with vast grasslands, but in forests, ancient and forgotten. For even at the dawn of the Fourth Age, these woods stretched from the foothills of the Grey Mountains to the edges of the Brown Lands, and from the Anduin Valley in the west to the shores of the Long Lake in the east. A real disaster for all those who wanted to get quickly from the west to the east of Middle-earth and back. Aside from only the ever-changing scattered paths, the few rivers and streams, the northern forest mountains and the naked hill Amon Lank in the south, there was nothing but dense undergrowth inhabited by numerous shady creatures, for literal hundreds of miles. However, Mirkwood had not always been so dark. It was only to be given this name in the second half of the Third Age, something we will touch upon later. The original name of that forest had been Erin Galen, Greenwood the Great. This forest was truly ancient, in a manner we living beings can hardly understand. For it was at the creation of the world that the Valia Yavanna, the Queen of Earth, spread the seeds for every plant in the world. Thus she created the gigantic primordial forests, which covered most of Middle-earth, including these ancient woods. Then came the time that the elves awoke and set out on their journey west through the impossible lands. When they finally reached the eastern borders of Greenwood the Great, even they found it imposing and overwhelming, for even in these times the undergrowth was rife with dark creatures and demons, the minions of Melkor, who lurked in the darkness and spread their horror into the world. Only by the great huntsman of the Valar, Orome, could they be driven out, and with his passing under the trees, the forest blossomed again in beauty and splendor. Thus the elves could resume their road west and see Greenwood the Great as it was created by Yavanna, flooded with light and rich in fruits and berries. Later, however, when their way west was once more slowed by the misty mountains high and the raging Anduin River wide, many of the elves chose to remain and settle in the green forest. These were the Nandor, the direct ancestors of the Sylvan Elves, which would inhabit the forest even during the War of the Ring. But not only the elves lived here. The dwarves also had their business in Greenwood, for it lay between the Iron Hills, where many Longbeard dwarves dwelt, and the Longbeard capital of Khazad-dûm. Thus the dwarves lay a great road through the forest in the First Age, and named it Men in Naugrin, the Forest Road, which made travelling a lot safer for the other races who had made their way through the woods that covered most of Middle-earth. But that was to change soon. It was a few centuries later, during the Second Age of the Sun, that the forests would recede. The Númenóreans had come from over the sea, desiring timber for their great fleets, for their island home could not produce enough. They created colonies on the continent, along with logging outposts, and they set up large trading networks to trade with the peoples living there. Thus, to feed the cogs of progress, many a tree met the logger's axe. Even Greenwood the Great shrank, becoming disconnected from what later would be Lothlorien and Fangorn. Around this time, a wave of Sindar from the lost lands of Beleriand travelled east and returned to their sylvan kin, and under the leaves of Greenwood the Great, they established the Woodland Realm and elected Orofer, the father of Thranduil, as their king. Yet even in the Third Age, the forest was not to be spared. The Northmen cleared huge areas in the east of the forest, forming the Great East Bight, which was at least 50 miles in diameter. The forest was not spared in the west either, because the ancestors of the Rohirrim, who lived in the Anduin valleys, also needed more and more wood and living space, raising huge areas of the forest there as well. Nevertheless, the forest was vast, and it remained a well-inhabited place, especially in the south, where many wood elves and humans lived. However, this too was not to last forever. For around the turn of the first millennium of the Third Age, a dark shadow spread over the forest. The Dark Lord Sauron, slowly recovering from his defeat at the Battle of the Last Alliance, now turned his fiendish gaze to the south of the forest. The darkness grew with his evil aura, and dark creatures settled in the thicket, like the giant spiders, the brood of Ungoliant. And this is when Greenwood the Great, now reduced in size and shrouded in evil darkness, was to receive its new name, Taur en Daedalus, Mirkwood. Thranduil, the newly crowned king of the Woodland Realm after his father's death, moved his court to the north of the forest, where he founded his new capital, the underground Elven King's Halls. Now Sauron's time had come. He occupied the ruins of the Wood Elves on Amon Lanc and established his necromantic stronghold of Dol Guldur there, striking fear and terror throughout the forest and its adjacent lands for many centuries. The forest grew darker, denser, and covered with numerous spider webs. From then on, it was a place of horror, and this would not change anytime soon. Because over 2,000 years later, when Thorin and his companions had to cross the forest on their way to the lonely mountain, they nearly lost themselves to the treacherousness of the woods and nearly died to the giant spiders. Even after the White Council attacked the forest at the end of the Third Age and Sauron deserted it, the forest would not receive the chance to improve. For a mere few decades later, the dread fortress of Dol Guldur was again occupied by Sauron's servants, the Nazgul, causing orcs and other fiends to roam the undergrowth again. A few years later, during the unfolding events of the War of the Ring, Dol Guldur still remained among the greatest threats to the Free Peoples. Hosts of orcs set out to overthrow the elven kingdoms of Lothlorien and the Woodland Realm. However, their attempts were in vain, for the army of Thranduil withstood them in the north, and the elves of Lothlorien were prepared and attacked the orc army from the south. The fighting was bitter, and it was followed by a veritable bloodbath under the trees and devastating forest fires. Despite this, the elves prevailed, and the whole forest was purged of all of Sauron's fiends. And so Thranduil and Celeborn met in the middle of the forest on the day of the Elvish New Year and celebrated their victory. This was also the day on which Mirkwood would be renamed once more. It was to be called Erin Lasgalen, the Wood of Green Leaves. The two elven rulers divided the forest into three. Thranduil took all the northern regions as far as the mountains that rise in the forest for his realm, and Celeborn took all the southern woods below the Narrows and named it East Lorien, and all the white forest between was given to the Beornings and the Woodmen. However, these great elven realms were not to last forever, for many of them went west, and those who remained there gradually hid themselves from the sight of the world, as with the fourth age of the sun, the age of men had dawned. And so the fate of Erin Lasgalen, Mirkwood, of Greenwood the Great, remains uncertain, as it is now in the hands of the wills and desire of the short-lived race of man. Thus we conclude this chapter and this video. Did this knowledge surprise you? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed it and would like to learn more of the world of Tolkien, be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when Mysteries of Westerness returns to Arda. This has been Irjikor Kurubane, and I wish you all Namari Meldonyar.